go through the process of installing a front vise. What I'm going to describe will take you through the process of installing the carriage on the underside of your bench and mounting the rods through the rear and front face of those jaws. There are also ways to install these vices so that the rear jaw is actually recessed into this edge of the bench, or perhaps you don't have a rear jaw at all, you're just using the edge or the front of your workbench. But the installation will be much the same. You would just ignore the bits that are to do with the rear jaw if you're just going to install it flush on the edge of your workbench. So the first thing you're going to have to do is cut those front and rear jaws. Now, in my case, I've decided to make them the full width of my workbench, which is 600mm. It's a little on the long side. It means that when you're using it, you need to make sure that the vice jaws stay parallel to one another. For instance, it's not ideal to clamp something way over this side if it's unsupported over here. It will still hold it, but what you'll find is that those vice jaws are becoming out of parallel and you're losing some of that strength. There are ways to overcome that. People very commonly make little blocks that just hang off the edge, little racking blocks, and basically they have a variety of thicknesses. You put something of an equivalent thickness in this side so that you get a really firm hold wherever you are. Like I said, my jaws, my faces are 600 wide. They're deeper than my bench. They're around 140mm deep. The solid top of my bench is about 70mm deep. I wanted that nice depth to provide additional clamping surface area down the side of the vise here. Because I'm doing full width, I've decided to locate my vise centrally, right in the center of the bench. You can just as easily offset it. You could also offset it and not have a full length jaw as well. That would be another quite common way to install it. But again, that positioning stuff doesn't affect the actual installation too greatly. I'll walk through all of those steps in more detail to help clarify some of those finer points. When I flipped the workbench upside down, I pushed it up a little bit on the undercarriage so that I had a flat surface protruding out from under the top that I could place my jaws on upside down as well so they wouldn't fall down any lower, and it gives me a reference surface that is in fact referencing where this top will be, nice and flat. So doing all of this on a flat surface makes it a lot easier. Then I located the undercarriage and made sure it was central, and using a 20mm Forstner bit for the rods, I placed them through the holes in the carriage and marked a little dimple with the sharp end of the Forstner bit on my front jaw, not my rear jaw. I carried that through for both rod holes, and then I used a 25mm Forstner bit to mark a little dimple in the location for the screw hole, also in the front jaw. The reason to mark the front jaw first is we're going to drill that out, and then we're going to use that as a template to mark the rear jaw. The bars themselves are about 20mm wide, but it will be beneficial to you to drill your holes out to be about 22mm. Similarly, the screw is 30mm wide, but you'll really want to drill a 32mm hole. If you make them too tight, you run into all kinds of problems with alignment, and it's easier just to give yourself that little bit of wiggle room. So drill out those 3 holes on your front jaw at 22mm and 32mm for the center screw. Then hold that over your rear jaw and use it again with that Forstner bit technique to mark center points for drilling holes on the rear jaw. We'll now use those location points that we've placed on the rear jaw to drill out a large 60mm recess for the support collets which sit behind the rear jaw. If you're installing a much smaller vise, you don't really need the support collets, but what they do is provide additional support for the rods and you screw them into the rear of that big rear jaw. It takes some of the pressure off the carriage itself, so you're relying less on just those screws that hold the carriage to the underside of your table. Once you've drilled out that large 60mm recess around the 2 bar holes on the rear jaw, you can then drill through all of those holes for 22mm for the bars and 32mm for the screw. Now that you've drilled out all of your holes on your two jaws, put them in place on top of your workbench and make sure you can pass those bars and screw through both of them and they move freely because they need to. By placing the bars and the screw through the jaws and then into the carriage, it allows you to position the carriage exactly where you need it to be on the underside of the table and lining up the edge of those jaws with the edge of your workbench. If you're not installing a full width end vise, then the positioning is just a matter of aligning those edge of those jaws with wherever you need them to be on your particular bench. With that carriage in location, I screwed, pre-drilled and screwed 2 screws through the carriage to hold it in place. I then removed the full bar and screw mechanism so that I could get to the rest of the screws. And then I tightened the whole carriage down from there, pre-drilling and screwing all, I believe there's 7 screws. While the jaws are placed over the bars and screws, you can now install the support collets on the rear of the rear jaw. I just used a couple of small screws. It's not really having to take a whole bunch of force. The collet itself sitting in the recess is taking the force. The screws are just holding it in position. One step that I had to do that you might not have to do was I had to drill some holes in the undercarriage of my actual vise table. The reason for that is because I'm installing the vise on the end, the bars and the screws had to pass through one of the crossbars of my carcass, of my undercarriage here. If you're installing this vise side on, as in a traditional front vise, you probably won't be interfering with your leg or carcass or rails, so you wouldn't need to do that. But basically what I did is I used one of my jaws, which had already been pre-drilled, as a template to drill the holes that I needed on the crossbar of my undercarriage. The holes I drilled on the undercarriage, I made a little wider than even the holes in the jaw, just to make sure I had plenty of clearance and no interference in any way as those jaws, just in case they sagged or they moved around when they're under normal clamping operation. Now that your carriage is installed, you've got those support collets mounted on the rear of the rear jaw, you can actually assemble the whole operation, and to do that, you're better off to flip the entire table the right way up. The next step is to mount the rear jaw directly onto your tabletop. Now, to do that, you really need some way of holding that jaw in location so that it won't move, to allow you to pre-drill those holes and put those nice big screws in. I ended up using 125mm bugle screws. They seemed nice and long and strong enough for this particular job. It's important to keep in mind, if you've got cross-directional grain, like I do in this situation, that there's going to be movement in your tabletop that won't necessarily be at the same rate as the movement in your vise jaws. We need to allow for that movement and make sure that it's not straining against our metal fasteners. One way to allow for that is to just make the holes that go through your jaw a few mil larger than the fixings that you're using. So in my case, I'm using bugle screws. I think they're about 6 or 7 mil in diameter. And so I used a drill bit that was a few millimeters larger than that to pre-drill the holes in my jaw. Now, the drill that you'll use to pre-drill the holes for the bugle thread itself in the bench top, you want that to be firm, because that's what's holding this vise face onto the bench. But by having those pre-drilled holes in your jaw larger, it means that as the bench top expands and contracts, those screws have a little bit of room to wiggle within the jaw itself. There are some other neat ways of doing it. People occasionally expand those holes longitudinally using a router table. So you'd pre-drill the hole, put a really thin router bit in there, and then push the jaw forward and backwards to make those holes a little longer. There's also ways to put a big spline through the jaw and through the workbench top. It's another really nice firm way of attaching this. But you can think of it kind of like a breadboard join, in that you've got cross-directional timber and you want to allow for that movement. So keep that in mind. Now that the rear jaw is installed, and hopefully it's nice and flush because you've had it clamped the whole time, you can undo the entire clamp screw and then feed the front jaw back onto the threads, screw the whole thing back in tight, and now the last thing you need to do is screw the front plate of the vise onto the front drawer. That's really simple. Nothing is really in your way, so you can do it while it's all assembled. Make sure with those little screws that they're not going to poke through the face of your jaw. It's obvious, but it'd be sad if that happened. Once it's all screwed in, I closed it up, I squared off any slightly not square edges with a plane and a sander, and it feels really nice and smooth. That's basically the whole vise installation.